They fought in a land that never knew their names, yet their blood turned Europe's soil red. From Punjab's fields to France's trenches, they carried courage farther than anyone remembered. They marched beneath a foreign flag, but every heartbeat whispered of home. No medals, no parades, just silence where their stories should have lived. In the mud of Flanders and the snows of Italy, Indian voices once shouted through the smoke of war. History forgot their faces, but the earth they fought for never did. When war spread across Europe, few imagined that men from distant villages in India would be called to fight in its cold fields. Yet by 1940, more than 2.5 million Indian soldiers wore khaki under the British flag, the largest volunteer army in history. From Bengal to Baluchistan, recruitment posters promised adventure, honor, and pay for families back home. But when they arrived in France, Italy, and North Africa, the air smelled not of glory but of mud, smoke, and fear. Many had never seen snow before. They wrapped their turbans tighter against the freezing wind. Letters home spoke of comrades lost, of strange food, and skies that never cleared. Locals stared at them with a mix of awe and confusion, brown faces in a white man's war. Yet when the fighting began, courage spoke the same language. At Cassino, Montefiore, and Dunkirk's ruins, their blood mixed into Europe's soil quietly without recognition. For many, the journey to Europe began with a single name whispered through dusty railway stations: Frontline. They were farmers, carpenters, clerks, sons of quiet families who had never left their provinces. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder with men whose languages they could not understand, staring at maps of places they had never heard of: Normandy, Dunkirk, Dieppe. British officers shouted orders, interpreters translated, but the roar of artillery drowned everything. They learned fast, building trenches in frozen ground, hauling ammunition through sleet and rain. Some fought with rifles that jammed in the cold, others carried wounded men miles through enemy fire. They did it without complaint. The letters they wrote home were censored, their stories shortened to a few safe lines: "We are well. The war continues." Yet behind those words lived exhaustion, pride, and a quiet belief that their duty would somehow matter even if no one remembered their names. Winter in Europe was merciless to men born under the Indian sun. The cold bit through their wool uniforms and froze the sweat beneath their collars. In the forests of France and along the alpine ridges of Italy, Indian regiments dug shallow shelters into ice and mud, lighting tiny fires to survive the nights. Their breath fogged in the dark while distant shellfire echoed like thunder. Some had only sandals when they arrived, their toes wrapped in rags, fingers cracked and bleeding. They slept on frozen ground, listening to rats move through the trenches. Yet even in that misery, they shared what little warmth they had: a cup of tea brewed in a dented tin, a folded photograph passed from one pair of trembling hands to another. Letters from home arrived soaked or torn, but they were read and reread until the words blurred. The 4th and 8th Indian Divisions earned quiet respect from Allied commanders who had once doubted them. When the orders came to attack, they rose without hesitation, charging through snow and shrapnel with the cry of "Jai Hind" echoing over the gunfire. The world never saw their faces, but Europe heard their courage. It carried on the wind between the mountains. In the chaos of war, courage often came quietly. Indian medics carried stretchers through falling shells, their khaki coats soaked in blood and rain. They worked without masks or gloves, whispering prayers as they bound wounds and gave sips of water to dying men. British, French, even German. For them, suffering had no uniform. Sikh soldiers stood guard over makeshift hospitals, reciting verses softly while the wounded groaned through the night. In one camp near Monte Cassino, a sepoy refused evacuation after shrapnel tore his leg. He stayed behind to guide others to safety until his voice gave out. Such stories were rarely written down. Reporters photographed the ruins, not the men cleaning them. Yet their names filled casualty lists that no one in Europe could pronounce. They fought not for reward or empire, but because a promise had been made to serve, to endure, and to bring honor to the soil that raised them. Long after the guns fell silent, their silence remained louder than victory. Spring came late that year, turning the battlefields into rivers of melted snow and mud. In northern Italy, Indian soldiers pushed through ruined villages, their boots sinking deep with every step. They fought beside British, Polish, and New Zealand units, moving house to house under sniper fire. The air stank of smoke and wet stone. When supplies ran out, they scavenged from wrecked convoys, cooking thin soups from army rations and whatever they could find. Still they marched. Locals peeked from shuttered windows, startled to see men with dark faces and calm eyes offering bread to hungry children. For a moment, war paused in that simple kindness. At the Gothic line, the Indian divisions broke through positions that had held for months, capturing high ground at the cost of hundreds of lives. Their victory opened the road to Bologna, a moment of triumph that would soon fade from headlines. History would remember the generals, but not the tired men who carried their hopes through the mud. In the trenches, they found brotherhood stronger than language. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Christian. Men from every corner of India shared rations, laughter, and fear beneath the same gray sky. When shells fell, no one asked who prayed to which god. They simply held the line together. Some read letters under candlelight, others sang softly of home songs about rivers, fields, and mango trees that felt like another lifetime away. British soldiers, once distant, began calling them the quiet ones, not for their silence, but for their discipline. They never complained, even when frostbite blackened their fingers or rations arrived half-frozen. One officer wrote, "They endure more than any men I've ever seen." And it was true. Beneath the roar of guns, they built fires, mended socks, and carried on with a stubborn grace that defied despair. War had taken them far from India, but their courage made every frozen trench feel like sacred ground. Letters from home became their lifeline. Each envelope carried the scent of dust and sunlight, a small reminder of a world untouched by war. Mothers wrote of harvests, sisters of weddings postponed, fathers of pride and worry tangled together. The soldiers read those words again and again until the paper frayed. Some carried them tucked inside helmets, others tied them around their necks with bits of string. In return, they sent back words carefully chosen, hiding fear, exaggerating hope. "We are winning," they wrote, though victory was still far away. The censors cut out sentences about hunger or loss, but emotion bled through the ink. One man ended every letter with the same line, "Tell the children to be brave." When the post stopped coming, they knew the front had moved again, and so had death. In those quiet moments between battles, their hearts fought a different war one against distance and forgetting. In the French countryside, Indian transport units became the unseen spine of the Allied advance. Long after the guns stopped firing each night, their trucks rumbled through shattered villages, headlights dimmed to slits. They hauled fuel, food, and ammunition over roads cratered by bombs. Sometimes they drove for 30 hours straight, hands stiff from the cold, eyes stinging from exhaustion. When bridges were destroyed, they built new ones from scrap wood and rope, working knee-deep in freezing rivers. Locals often mistook them for colonial troops from somewhere else. No one imagined men from Punjab or Bihar could be there, feeding the very machine that would free Europe. Yet without them, the armies would have starved before victory came. In diaries written on ration paper, they called themselves the ghosts of the road. They left no monuments behind, only tire tracks that rain washed away before morning. Among the ruins of Normandy, Indian engineers rebuilt what bombs had erased. They cleared mines with their bare hands, mapped bridges under sniper fire, and laid steel tracks for trains that would carry wounded soldiers home. Their work began when others slept. Long nights under flares, the ground trembling with distant explosions. One sapper from Bengal wrote, "We fix what war breaks." They didn't wear medals or carry flags, but their tools became weapons of endurance. In France, villagers brought them bread and milk, surprised to hear Hindi and Urdu in the quiet dawn. The soldiers smiled shyly, unsure if they were seen as allies or strangers. Yet when a convoy rolled safely across one of their makeshift bridges, the applause that followed was enough. Their reward was not in ceremony or song, it was in knowing that for one more night, the road to freedom had held firm beneath their hands. In the hospitals behind the front lines, Indian nurses and orderlies worked under dim lanterns, their uniforms stained with smoke and iodine. They moved silently between cots, tending to men who called out for mothers in languages they didn't understand. Some sang softly in Punjabi or Urdu, believing that calm could travel through tone if not through words. The wounded clutched their hands like lifelines, not caring where they came from, only that they stayed. Many of those nurses had left their own families behind in Bombay and Calcutta, trained in a rush before being sent to Europe. They endured the same air raids and rationing as the soldiers they cared for. When bombs fell nearby, they simply covered the patients and went on working. No history book recorded their names, yet thousands of men lived because of them. In the long silence after each battle, Their footsteps were the first signs that hope had survived the night. In the chaos of retreat and advance, some Indian soldiers found themselves defending towns whose names they could barely pronounce. In the Ardennes, they fought through forests so thick the sun never reached the ground. Snow turned red underfoot, and the air stank of cordite and fear. Yet they held their positions until the last bullet, covering Allied withdrawals that might have turned into massacres without them. Locals remembered their kindness. Men who shared rations with hungry children, who repaired doors instead of breaking them. One French farmer kept a diary entry: "The brown soldiers gave my daughter chocolate." Then they marched toward the noise. None of them came back. They were buried in churchyards under white crosses engraved only with a serial number and the words, "A soldier of the Indian Army." Their graves still lie scattered across Europe's silent witnesses to courage history never bothered to remember. As the war dragged on, their uniforms faded from khaki to gray, their boots cracked, and their eyes grew older than their years. Yet the Indian divisions kept moving. From Italy's shattered towns to the narrow streets of southern France. They were always where the danger was greatest, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. In one village near the Rhone, they liberated hundreds of civilians trapped under shellfire. The people cheered, shouting "Vive l'Inde," without knowing what it meant, only that these strangers had saved them. The soldiers smiled, waved shyly, and marched on before dawn. They carried no banners, no photographers followed them, and no politicians praised them afterward. But among the troops, word spread quietly. The Indian units never failed their orders. They fought with precision and discipline that came not from pride, but from something deeper: duty carved into the heart. Even in victory, they walked softly, leaving only footprints where glory might have been. Letters from those soldiers took months to reach India, each one smelling faintly of smoke and sea salt. They wrote in neat Urdu or Hindi script, sometimes mixing English words they'd learned from officers. "We are fine," many began, even when they weren't. They told their mothers the snow looked like sugar, their fathers that Europe was cold but beautiful, their younger brothers to study hard and stay away from mischief. Few mentioned the gunfire or the friends buried in foreign soil. The British censors cut out anything too real: no blood, no grief, no truth. But sometimes emotion slipped through. One letter found in an archive decades later simply read, "Tell Amma the stars here look like home." Those words, written in a trench under enemy fire, became one of the only surviving traces of men who had crossed continents to fight a war that would never know their names. When victory finally came, it did not sound like trumpets for them. Only silence and orders to pack up. The Indian divisions that had marched through snow and thunder were quietly sent home, their medals boxed, their names misspelled in reports. In ports like Marseille and Naples, they waited for ships that would take them back across the sea. Some carried souvenirs: a pressed flower, a photograph with a French child, a piece of shrapnel they'd kept as proof of survival. The locals wept as they left, calling them brothers, while the officers barely looked up from their paperwork. No parades awaited them in Bombay, only the humid air and the sound of trains heading inland. Families stood on platforms, scanning faces, not knowing that many would never step off those carriages. Europe moved on, rebuilding its cities, but for these men, the war never ended. It lived in their dreams, in the echoes of foreign winds whispering through forgotten metals. Back in India, the soldiers returned to a nation that was changing beneath their feet. The air buzzed with talk of independence, of freedom long overdue. Many came home still wearing the British crown on their sleeves, unsure where they truly belonged. They had fought for an empire that no longer had a place for them, and for a country that was still finding its own name. Some joined the rallies, shouting, "Quit India," beside men who had once cursed the British uniforms they wore. Others sat in silence, polishing medals that no one asked about. The world had turned its page, but their story had no line on it. In dusty towns and quiet villages, they blended back into the crow. Bakers, farmers, postmen carrying memories heavier than any weapon. When people asked what Europe was like, they smiled faintly and said, "Cold, very cold." And that was all. Years passed, and their names faded from newspapers and speeches. Monuments were built for generals and kings, not for the men who froze in French trenches wearing turbans beneath steel helmets. In British museums, their photographs gathered dust, labeled simply Indian troops. No mention of who they were. Sons of Punjab, Bihar, and Bengal, or what they had endured. But in a few villages, small shrines stood quietly beneath banyan trees. Rusted rifles leaned against stone walls, and framed black and white portraits smiled beneath layers of incense smoke. Mothers lit lamps for sons who never came back, whispering prayers in languages the world never learned to honor. And when the wind passed through those trees, it sounded almost like marching boots, steady, distant, proud, as if those forgotten soldiers still walked, somewhere between history and memory, waiting to be remembered. In the first years after the war, India was changing, and so were its men. Those who had once marched through the ruins of France and Italy now found themselves walking dusty village paths under a different kind of sun. The world called them heroes, but home treated them as reminders of someone else's empire. Some had returned with missing fingers, others with scars that never healed, and many with eyes that had seen too much to ever rest. When thunder rolled over the monsoon sky, they flinched as if the war had followed them home. The smell of wet earth could bring back the scent of European mud. At night, they dreamed in languages they didn't speak, calling out to comrades who were gone. Yet each morning they rose before dawn, tilled their fields, repaired their roofs, and saluted the flag of a free India. In that small gesture, silent and unseen, lived the dignity of men who had fought for two nations. One that ruled them and one that was still learning to stand. Many of them faced an invisible battle long after the guns had fallen silent. Bureaucracy, poverty, and indifference became their new enemies. Promised pensions arrived late, if at all. Their medals gathered dust in tin boxes while the country moved on. Some became school teachers, others sold tea by the roadside, their wartime stories turning into legends whispered between sips. When they spoke of the war, it was never about glory, it was about frostbitten fingers, brothers lost in the snow, and the strange kindness of strangers in faraway lands. They remembered how French villagers had shared bread when rations ran out, how Italian children had waved from behind broken walls. The war had shown them both the worst and the best of humanity, and though they lived in silence, their pride was unbroken. For them, victory was not written in medals or parades. It was in the simple act of surviving, of returning home when the odds said they never would. The world forgot them quickly. In British books, their bravery became a passing mention, a single paragraph lost among the triumphs of others. No monuments carried their names, no films told their stories. But memory has a way of surviving where history fails. In Punjab, old men still tell tales of a soldier who fought in the snows of Casino and came home with a foreign coin he kept for luck. In Bengal, a grandmother still lights a candle each November for a son who never returned. These small, unrecorded rituals keep the truth alive. That India's sons fought not for conquest, but for comradeship. They fought because they were asked to, and they gave everything because they believed it was right. The fields they returned to were the same ones they had left, yet something in them had changed forever. They had seen the edge of the world and left part of their souls there. In Europe, time softened the scars of war, but not the silence. Travelers walking through military cemeteries still find rows of white stones marked with crescent moons and names that sound foreign on European tongues. Singh, Khan, Patel, Ali, carved in cold marble, guarded by poppies and quiet skies. Sometimes schoolchildren on field trips pause to ask who these men were. The guide answers simply, they came from India, but the truth is deeper. They came from villages that didn't appear on maps, from farms that could barely feed them, and yet they crossed oceans to fight for a world that would never remember them. Their graves are not just reminders of war. They are testaments to a loyalty that defied distance and despair. Beneath the rain-soaked soil of France and Italy, they sleep far from home, soldiers of an empire that forgot them, but sons of a land that still carries their blood in its dust. Years later, when the last of those veterans gathered for Republic Day parades, they walked slower but stood taller. The crowd saw their medals sparkle under the sun, unaware of the winters those medals had endured. When a young reporter once asked an old sepoy what he remembered most, the man smiled faintly and said, "The silence after the shooting stopped." For them, that silence was sacred. It carried the weight of friendship, of loss, of promises made in the mud and never broken. As they passed down the final stretch of the parade, they saluted not the dignitaries in the stands but the ghosts who marched beside them. And in that quiet salute lived the essence of their legacy: courage without recognition, sacrifice without reward, and pride without bitterness. They had fought for a freedom that outlived them, and in doing so, they became part of something larger than history itself. In forgotten corners of Europe, traces of the Indian regiments still breathe under layers of time. The damp forests of Italy hold rusted helmets engraved with unfamiliar names, and old farmhouses in France still hide postcards that never reached Punjab or Calcutta. A farmer once plowing near Casino found a khaki button with Indian Army etched faintly across it. He placed it on his mantle as a charm. To him, it was just an artifact. To history, a heartbeat. The marigold flowers that villagers leave each November beside the stone plaques were never native to Europe, yet they bloomed defiantly in foreign soil, a touch of India carried by memory. Every autumn rain that falls on those graves washes stories back into the earth of young men who crossed oceans not for empire, but for duty. The wind moves gently through those silent fields, whispering in forgotten tongues Urdu, Tamil, Punjabi, reminding the world that courage once spoke in many accents, and sacrifice was never bound by color or creed. Back home, far from the chill of Europe, letters arrived months late, crumpled, faded, scented faintly of salt and sweat. They were read aloud in courtyards beneath banyan trees where time seemed to pause. Wives listened in silence, mothers prayed over each word, and children repeated names they could barely pronounce: Monte Cassino, Anzio, Normandy. "We are fine," the letters said, though fingers were numb and friends gone. "Do not worry," they insisted, as though reassurance could bridge oceans. Radios crackled at night, their static hiding fear, and every bicycle bell on the road made hearts jump. Maybe the postman was near. Some messages never came. The silence that replaced them became part of the family. Still, hope refused to die. When the war ended, not every soldier returned, but their words did. Folded inside drawers and tin boxes, they outlived the men who wrote them, carrying stories that official reports ignored. And in every unread sentence lay a small victory. Proof that love could travel farther than war itself. When liberation finally swept across Europe, Indian battalions were their silent shadows among the cheering crowds. In the ruins of Monte Cassino, they hoisted flags beside the shattered abbey, and villagers offered them bread, wine, and tears. No one understood their language, yet gratitude needed no translation. Along the river, they marched through villages where bells rang for the first time in years, their boots soaked in snowmelt and mud. Children followed them, waving at the men whose faces carried exhaustion and kindness in equal measure. They sang softly hymns and folk songs of distant lands, mixing with the chimes of freedom. Allied commanders wrote in their diaries of the brown soldiers who fought like lions, but history filed them under footnotes. Yet those who saw them never forgot. The villagers would say later, "The angels who came from the east wore turbans." And long after the tanks had rusted, those words remained. Carried by wind and memory, proof that even in war's darkest season, humanity still found ways to bloom. When the guns finally fell silent, history began choosing which stories to remember and which to forget. Reports praised generals, strategies, and nations, but not the nameless men who bled in borrowed uniforms. 2.5 million Indians had served across continents, yet when the war ended, they came home quietly. No parades, no flags, just weary faces and suitcases smelling of salt and oil. Many found their villages changed beyond recognition. Some were greeted with pride, others with suspicion. "You fought for the British," people whispered, not realizing they had also fought for humanity itself. The medals they carried were small, dull pieces of metal, but the memories behind them were heavy as mountains. Some buried their ribbons deep in trunks, unwilling to display them. Others hung them near family portraits, a silent reminder that bravery doesn't always come with applause. And though history's spotlight dimmed, their courage glowed like embers, unseen, uncelebrated, but burning quietly beneath the surface of a nation learning to stand on its own. Among those returning soldiers were stories too fragile for textbooks. Small, human acts of valor that never made it to headlines. A Gurkha who carried his wounded officer through enemy fire without a word. A Sikh sapper who defused mines by touch, his turban streaked with sweat and soot. A Muslim cook who gave his ration to a dying comrade and said simply, "He needs it more." These weren't grand gestures meant for glory, they were reflexes of decency, done when no one was watching. In war's chaos, humanity was their rebellion. They built bridges of compassion across languages, faiths, and uniforms, proving that courage was colorless. When they returned home, they spoke little of these moments. Words could not carry what silence already held. But their children noticed the way their fathers stared at the horizon a little longer, or touched their medals before dawn prayers. Some wounds never healed. but from those scars grew the quiet strength that shaped a generation who had learned what sacrifice truly meant. As years passed and independence arrived, the veterans watched from the sidelines, proud, yet unsure where they fit in the new story being written. Some had fought beside men who were now across a border, divided by politics but united by memory. When they met at rare reunions, there were no speeches, no flags, only tea, laughter, and old photographs passed around like sacred relics. "Do you remember Casino?" one would ask, and for a moment the air would thicken with ghosts. The world outside argued over nations and names, but among them the bond remained unbroken. They were no longer sepoys or officers, just brothers who had faced death and refused to bow. Their eyes carried both pride and loss, for they knew they had built freedom that others would inherit. And though their hands trembled with age, their salutes never did. In every gathering, every handshake, lived a quiet truth: wars end, but the fellowship of those who survived them does not. In archives and museums today, history tries to restore what memory never forgot. Curators handle old photographs with gloved hands. Sepoys grinning in trenches, soldiers sharing cigarettes beneath camouflage nets, a cook stirring tea beside a muddy truck. The faces are grainy, the smiles uncertain, yet they pulse with life. Beneath each image lies a story unnamed, uncaptioned, waiting to be heard again. Scholars write of tactics and empires, but the truth hides between the folds of those faded letters of friendship, hunger, and faith. The curators label them by regiment numbers, but what mattered was never the number, it was the bond. Each uniform, though torn and stained, was a reminder that courage is not born of rank but of resolve. The museum lights cast gentle halos on the glass displays, but to those who know, these aren't relics, they're echoes. And every whisper of turning paper, every breath inside those quiet halls, feels like a prayer to remember the men who gave their youth so the world could grow old in peace. Now, across the rolling fields and graveyards of Europe, their names are carved in stone: Singh, Khan, Das, Pillai. Names that once echoed through monsoon villages now rest beneath European skies. The marble glows pale in the morning mist, and each headstone tells a story without speaking. Visitors pause, reading aloud words they cannot fully understand, but even mispronounced, those names live again. Some locals still place wildflowers by the graves, not because they remember faces, but because gratitude endures longer than memory. Beneath those stones lies not just sacrifice, but a bridge between worlds of language, faith, and soil. In that silence, you can almost hear the hum of forgotten hymns carried on the wind, the rhythm of marching boots blending with the heartbeat of the earth. The war ended long ago, but the peace that followed bears their fingerprints. And as long as the dawn rises over those resting fields, their watch, quiet, steadfast, eternal, continues. The story of the Indian soldiers in Europe is not one of conquest or surrender, but of endurance, the quiet kind that outlasts history itself. They fought in lands they'd never seen, under skies that never felt like home, yet gave their all as if defending their own villages. They marched through snow barefoot, faced doubt from allies, and indifference from those they saved, yet never let bitterness take root. Their bravery didn't roar, it resonated. Their victory wasn't marked by medals but by the lives they preserved. And though time has blurred their names and photos, their legacy breathes through every freedom enjoyed today. History may have overlooked them, but the soil of Europe hasn't. Beneath every field that blooms, every dawn that breaks, lies a fragment of their spirit, unyielding, unforgotten, immortal. For true courage, like light through fog, never fades. It only finds new ways to shine. Today, when the world speaks of the Second World War, their names rarely surface. Yet in the echo of marching boots, in the hush before dawn, their presence lingers. They were farmers, barbers, teachers. Ordinary men who became extraordinary under impossible odds. They didn't fight for statues or history books. They fought for one another. The world moved on, but they left behind something more permanent than victory: dignity. When the last of them saluted their fallen comrades, they carried a nation's forgotten heartbeat in that gesture. No anthem played, yet the silence said everything. Now, decades later, as we walk through a world built on their courage, remembering them is not a favor, it is a duty. For they proved what humanity forgets too often, that greatness is not in power, but in compassion. And as long as someone speaks their story, even in a whisper, they are not gone, they are home.